The chair was pushed in farther than the others that morning. That is the first thing I remember. Not the food, not the hymn we had sung before breakfast, not even the rain tapping against the kitchen window. I remember that chair tucked neatly under the table as if no one had ever sat there. My daughter had been gone 3 weeks by then, and every morning I told myself the same thing. This was the order of things. This was what obedience looked like. This was what God required of us. I said those words so often that I almost stopped hearing what they meant. Almost. My name is Mahlon. I have been Amish all my life. I'm a grandfather now, and I have lived on the same piece of land for more years than I care to count. I have watched children become parents, watched barns rise where fields used to be, and watched good people make choices they believed were faithful even when those choices cost them dearly. I share these things because age has a way of taking the sharp edges off our excuses. If you have ever told yourself that something painful had to be right simply because it was familiar, I would be interested to know that. Sometimes a person can carry a belief for half a lifetime before he finally asks what it has made of him. My daughter's name was Miriam. She was my second child and my first daughter. As a little girl, she had a way of noticing what everyone else missed. If a hen stopped laying, she noticed. If her mother was tired before supper, she noticed. If I had left a gate unlatched, she would find it before the calves did. She was not loud, she was not troublesome. That is important to say, because when people hear that a daughter left an Amish home, they often imagine a rebellious child pushing against every rule. Miriam was not like that. She was careful, she learned quickly. She could piece a quilt with straighter seams than women twice her age, and she handled a team of horses with the kind of quiet hand you cannot teach. When she was young, I thought obedience came naturally to her. I know now that what looked like obedience was often thoughtfulness. She considered things before she agreed to them. I mistook her silence for certainty. That was my first mistake. The year everything changed was a wet one. The corn came up uneven. The lane stayed muddy into June, and there was a sour smell in the lower field where water would not drain. Miriam was grown by then. She had begun asking questions about the church, not rude questions, not questions meant to embarrass anyone. She wanted to know why certain rules were treated as if they were scripture when she could not find them there. She wanted to know why one family was handled differently from another. She wanted to know whether fear could make a community look orderly without making it faithful. I did not like those questions. I did not dislike them because I had good answers. I disliked them because they made me uncomfortable. There is a difference, and I was old enough to know it even then. I had spent my life believing that a steady man did not disturb the ground beneath his own feet. You worked, you prayed, you kept your word, you honored the church. You did not turn every hard thing into a debate. That way of living had given me much. It had given me a wife I loved, children I was proud of, neighbors who came before they were called, and a life that felt rooted. So when Miriam began pressing on the difference between faith and custom, I heard it as a threat to everything good I had received. I did not hear the possibility that she might be trying to protect the faith from the customs we had wrapped around it. That winter there was a meeting at our house. I remember the smell of damp wool coats hanging by the door and the mud drying in little half-moons on the floorboards. The men sat in the front room. The women were farther back. Miriam had spoken to someone outside the church without permission about concerns she had been carrying. Nothing scandalous had happened. No crime. No secret romance. No wild life in town. She had simply reached outside the circle because she felt she could not speak freely inside it. But the fact that she had gone outside mattered more to some people than what she had been trying to say. I sat there with my hands folded and listened to men I respected speak about humility, order, submission, and danger. None of those words are bad words. That is part of what made the moment so difficult. Bad things are easier to reject when they come wearing ugly names. The hardest mistakes of my life came dressed in words I already trusted. Miriam was told what repentance would require. She listened. Her face was pale, but she did not cry. I watched her the way a father watches a daughter crossing a creek on stepping stones. I wanted her to put her foot where I thought it belonged. I wanted to tell myself that if she did, the whole family could get safely to the other side. She asked for time. That request was taken as more resistance. A week passed, then another. She did not agree to what was being asked of her. I told her that stubbornness could harden a heart. She asked me whether a person could also harden his heart by refusing to listen. I remember that because I had no answer. I gave her one anyway. Fathers do that sometimes. We fill the silence because being silent in front of our children feels too much like admitting we do not know. The final conversation happened near the wash line behind the house. The ground was frozen hard, and the sheets moved in the wind like pale flags. Miriam had packed one small case. I could see it near the back step. I knew then that the matter had gone farther than I had allowed myself to believe. She was not threatening to leave. She was leaving. I felt anger first. That surprises some people when I tell them. They expect sorrow. Sorrow came later. Anger was easier because anger let me remain the injured one. If she was doing this to us, then I did not have to ask what we had done to her. I told her that once she stepped away, there would be consequences. I told her I would not pretend disobedience was acceptable simply because she was my child. I told her there were boundaries I had not invented and could not move just to make room for her feelings. Every sentence sounded firm. Every sentence sounded responsible. I had spent decades learning how to speak that way. She listened, then she picked up her case. She looked at the house for a long moment. She looked at me, and she left. I did not call after her. That is the part that stayed with me. Not that she walked away, but that I let the distance grow in silence while she was still close enough to hear my voice. For the first few days, the house had a strange stillness. Her work was divided among the others. Her mother folded the apron Miriam had left behind and put it in a drawer. No one said much about it. In a plain household, routine can hide almost anything for a little while. Cows still need milking. Bread still needs kneading. Wood still needs carrying. A man can spend an entire day doing necessary things and never touch the one thing that matters most. I became very good at that. At supper, I kept my eyes on my plate. At breakfast, I looked toward the window. On Sunday, I listened carefully to every word of the sermon and hoped one of those words would make me feel settled. People told me I had done what a father had to do. They said time would soften her. They said wandering children sometimes returned when the world disappointed them. They said firmness now might save her later. I accepted those words because they asked nothing of me. They allowed me to wait. Waiting can look like patience when it is really fear. Then came the morning of the empty chair. It was a Tuesday. Rain had started before dawn. My boots were still wet from the barn, and there was steam rising from a bowl of oatmeal in front of me. Miriam's chair had always been on the far side of the table near the window. For 3 weeks, no one had sat there. That morning, my wife pushed it in after cleaning the floor. Just a simple thing. She pushed it all the way under the table. Suddenly the kitchen looked as if it had adjusted to Miriam's absence. That frightened me more than the absence itself. Loss is one thing when the room still expects a person back. It becomes something else when the room learns how to live without them. I stared at that chair until my oatmeal went cold. My wife was drying a cup with a flour sack towel. She had hardly spoken about Miriam since she left. We had both been careful, but for different reasons. I was careful because I did not want to question the decision. She was careful because she knew I was not ready to. She set the cup down and said one sentence. "You can call it God's will if you need to, Malin, but don't call it peace." Then she walked into the pantry. That was all. One sentence. I have heard longer sermons that changed me less. I sat there with the rain against the glass and thought about how easily I had been using God's name to cover my own fear. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying every rule is wrong. I'm not saying every boundary is cruelty. A family without any boundaries is not loving merely because it avoids conflict. A church that believes nothing strongly is not necessarily kind. I still believe discipline matters. I still believe obedience matters. I still believe a person can deceive himself by chasing whatever feeling comes next. But I had begun to see another danger. A man can also deceive himself by calling every inherited habit holy. He can use the word obedience when what he really wants is control. He can say he is protecting the family when he is protecting his own place in it. Most dangerous of all, he can attach God's name to his decision so no one is allowed to question him without seeming to question God. I had done some of that. Not all at once, not knowingly, but enough. The hardest thing for an old man is not discovering that the world has changed. The hardest thing is discovering that something inside him should have changed years ago and did not. I began to remember small moments with Miriam differently. Times she had asked why a neighbor's daughter was treated more harshly than a neighbor's son. Times she had gone quiet after certain conversations. Times she had tried to tell me that being afraid of disappointing people was not the same as fearing God. At the time, I had answered each moment separately. Now they began to form one long sentence, and I finally understood what she had been trying to say. She did not want a life without faith. She wanted faith that could survive a question. I had treated the question as the enemy. For several days I did nothing. That may sound strange after such a realization, but age does not make a man brave. Sometimes it only makes his habits stronger. I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to find her. I wanted to hear her voice. I wanted to know whether she was eating enough, whether she had a decent place to sleep, whether she was frightened, whether she thought about us when it rained. But wanting to do something and being willing to bear the cost of doing it are different matters. I knew people would ask questions if I reached out. I knew some would say I was weakening. I knew I might be accused of interfering with the discipline that had been set. I had spent my whole life trying not to be the kind of man who caused trouble in the church. Then I had a thought that embarrassed me with its simplicity. If my daughter believed I would choose the approval of other men over her, what had I taught her about the Father I claimed to serve? That question would not leave me. I walked the fence line that afternoon under a low gray sky. The posts were dark from rain. Water stood in the wagon ruts. I carried no tool because there was no work I truly meant to do. I was simply moving because I could not sit with myself. At the far end of the field there is an old maple. My children used to play near it. Miriam once buried a broken blue cup there because she thought throwing it away would make her mother sad. I had forgotten that until that afternoon. The memory came back so clearly I could see her small hands patting the dirt flat. Children reveal themselves early, but parents do not always pay attention. Miriam had always believed broken things should be handled gently. I had not handled her gently. The next morning I asked where she was staying. I will not tell you the details because that part belongs to her. I will only say that I found a way to send a message. I did not defend myself in it. I did not explain the church. I did not tell her what she needed to do next. I said I had been thinking about the empty chair. I said I missed my daughter. I said I was willing to listen if she was willing to speak. Then I waited. That waiting felt very different from the first kind. Before, I had waited for her to change. Now I waited knowing I might have to. Days passed. I found myself glancing toward the lane more often than I meant to. Every carriage wheel made me look up. Every time someone came to the door, something in my chest moved before I could stop it. Nothing happened. Then a letter came. It was not long. I read it alone in the barn because I did not trust myself to read it at the table. Miriam did not apologize for leaving. She did not ask to come home. She did not tell me I had been right, but she told me she loved us. She told me she had not left God. She told me that for the first time in years she could pray without feeling as if every prayer had to pass through the approval of another person. That line troubled me. It also relieved me. Those two feelings can sit beside each other. I had always feared that if she left our order, she would lose her faith. Her letter forced me to consider that perhaps she had left because she was trying to keep it. We exchanged letters after that, slowly, carefully. I learned not to turn every page into an argument. She learned that I was finally trying to hear what I had refused to hear before. There were things we still disagreed about. There are things we still disagree about now. Love does not erase conviction. It should not. But I came to understand that conviction without humility can become a wall so high that even the people we love cannot find the door. Months later, she visited. She did not come on a Sunday. She came on a weekday when the yard was quiet. I saw her from the barn. She was standing near the house with one hand on the gate. For a moment, I was back at the wash line watching her leave. Only this time I did not stay silent. I walked toward her. I do not remember what I said first. That surprises me because I remember the chair, the rain, the cold oatmeal, the blue cup under the maple, all of it. But I do not remember my first words when she returned. Maybe that is because the words were not the important part. I opened the gate. She came through. Her mother held her for a long time. I stood close enough to hear them both crying, and for once I did not try to make the moment orderly. Miriam sat at the table that afternoon, not in her old chair at first. She chose another one. I noticed. Of course I noticed the old chair remained near the window, and I understood that coming back did not mean going backward. A person cannot be pushed out of a room and then return as if nothing happened. We like restoration stories that end cleanly. Real ones rarely do. Trust returned in small pieces, a letter answered without argument, a visit without conditions, a meal where no one tried to settle the past before dessert, a father learning to ask a question and wait for the answer, a daughter learning that he might actually wait. Years have passed since then. Miriam has her own life now. I have grandchildren old enough to ask questions of their own, and when they do, I hear echoes I once tried to silence. I am not proud of the way I handled those years, but I am grateful I lived long enough to stop pretending that pride was faithfulness. There is a habit among old men of polishing our memories until we look wiser in them than we were. I do not want to do that. I was frightened. I was proud. I cared too much about being seen as steady and not enough about whether my steadiness had become hardness. And when my daughter's chair stayed empty, I called it God's will because that was easier than admitting I had helped empty it. What 70 years have taught me is this: be very careful whenever your explanation for someone else's pain makes you feel completely innocent. God may ask hard things of us. Faithfulness may cost us. Boundaries may be necessary. But if a belief never requires you to examine your own heart, only the hearts of everyone who disagrees with you, you may be protecting something other than truth. I still have that chair. The wood is worn smooth along the top rail. Sometimes one of the grandchildren sits in it now. Sometimes no one does. I do not look at it with the same shame I once did. Shame by itself is not much use. I look at it as a reminder. A house can become accustomed to an empty place, so can a heart. You have to decide whether that emptiness is truly peace or whether you have simply learned not to look at it. If these stories from a long Amish life mean something to you, you can subscribe and sit with me again. And I would like to ask you one thing before you go. Have you ever had to admit that something you once called necessary was really fear? I read more of those answers than you might think. Sometimes an old man can still learn from the people listening to him.